Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. After an intro like that, you think it's maybe better to just not speak at all. But I'm grateful, I'm moved. I'm especially moved that you're all here because it means at least some of you made your way over here during that downpour. So thank you especially for braving the Chautauqua rain to be here. And let's hope the weather holds out for this talk. As Melissa said, I was here several years ago, just before COVID, actually, in 2019. I was apparently the first Jewish chaplain at Chautauqua to be here for the week-long chaplaincy, and it was such a joy. And since then, a number of my colleagues have been here and have told me how much they loved and appreciated being in this beautiful environment. My husband, David, came with me along with our 3 children, and it was idyllic and wonderful. We called it a dreamscape, and it really is. And what I loved most about being here was the quest for ideas and understanding. And I was most moved by the people who actually waited after each sermon every morning to tell me exactly what they thought about the sermon, what they appreciated, and what they did not appreciate about my sermons, which made me feel right at home. And so I thank you. I do want to share that there's a very special Chautauqua connection for me and this book because my very dear book agent, literary agent, David McCormick, is a Chautauquan. Is that what we say? And so I feel so blessed to be also on your home turf here and now delivering a talk about this book that you helped birth into the world. And I want to actually just start there, if I can, David. David McCormick reached out to me maybe 12 years ago, kind of cold called or emailed me and said that somebody had sent him a sermon of mine and that he thought it might make a good book if I ever wanted to write a book. And I was a very busy young mother and rabbi and deleted the email. And then he wrote back about 6 months later and said, I read another sermon of yours. I think this could be a book. Let me know if you're interested. And I again deleted, and then again and again. And I actually think that your relentlessness is what ultimately got me to respond about 10 years later and say, okay, fine, let's talk about books. And David said, I'm sure there's a book that's living in you. What's the big idea you keep circling around? And I had a big idea. It was 10 different chapters. I wrote down 1 paragraph for each chapter. David said, this would be a good book, but the book that you should write is chapter 8. It was the chapter that I was going to call the Amen Effect. I realized, of course, that chapter 8 was the same sermon or talk that when I gave it here, or a short version of it here at Chautauqua, that was the sermon that everyone really stuck around to talk about, and not only to talk about, but actually to cry about. And so I realized right away that you were right, and I'm so grateful to you for encouraging me on this journey. So the Amen Effect. First of all, taking a movable mic away from a rabbi is like taking one of my superpowers. So I'm going to try to talk to you while standing still here, but this is not in my rabbinic training. So I think I want to start by sharing with you a story of the way that this idea has landed over the course of the past couple of months, and then I'll backtrack and tell you about the big idea. Several months ago, was traveling shortly after the launch of the book, and I received a call from a colleague of mine at IKAR, who was crying as she spoke on the phone at length about an encounter that she had just had at her pottery studio. She was seated across the way from a stranger, and she was listening to my book on her AirPods. And they smiled at each other and then went back to their work at the studio, as one does. But because she's listening to this book, which ultimately and fundamentally is about the power of human connection, she made the decision to take her AirPods out and actually begin to engage this stranger in conversation. And when she did, they started to talk about their lives, and she asked him if he had any children, and he said that he had 3 children. The 2 boys were 30 and 32. He then got up and walked over to the sink and got more water for his pottery. And my colleague was sitting at her wheel with a dilemma because she understood full well what he had done. He had hinted to her in no uncertain terms that he had 3 children, and then he told her about 2 of them. And so she gathered up all of her courage and countered her instincts and approached the man, and she said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question? It sounds to me like you lost a child. Do you want to talk about it?" And with tears in his eyes, he said, "I really do. Thank you." He said, "Just 2 years ago, my daughter died by suicide." And he said, "The hardest part of losing a child this way is that nobody wants to talk about it." And my colleague Beth said, "Well, I want to talk about it." And the 2 of them sat down, 2 strangers in a pottery studio in Los Angeles, and they talked for an hour about his daughter. And he shared with Beth a picture that he had taken with his daughter the morning that she died when they went out on a beautiful bike ride together. And he said he had been grappling for the last 2 years how it could be that someone who was this much in love with life could feel that she needed to die by the end of the day. But he had had no partner in grappling with that question until Beth asked him. So she called me and she said, "I just want to thank you because there was no part of me that wanted to go have that hard conversation with him. And I know it made a difference for him, but I also know that it made a difference for me." So this is the amen effect. When I was in rabbinical school, I accidentally encountered an ancient text in the Mishnah, an ancient Jewish code of law codified around the year 220 CE, a fairly obscure Mishnah about a ritual. It's from Midot. It's about a ritual that used to take place 2,000 years ago when the Jewish people would come from all across the land and some from the diaspora, and they would ascend to Jerusalem, a city on a hill, for their pilgrimage festival. And then they would climb the steps of the most sacred place, in the most sacred site, on the holiest of days. Hundreds of thousands of people would come together en masse. They would enter through one of those beautiful giant arched entryways that some of you have probably seen in Jerusalem in the Old City. And they would turn to the right and they would circle around the perimeter of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Hundreds of thousands of people all at once. And then they would leave essentially in the very same place where they had entered. That was it. That was the pilgrimage ritual that hundreds of thousands of people would come to year after year after year. Except, the text tells us, for someone who had a broken heart. Those people would go up to Jerusalem. They would ascend the steps of the Temple Mount. They would go through the same entryway, but whereas everyone else was turning to the right, those people with a broken heart would turn to the left. And they would have to navigate their way through the masses while holding their own broken heart. And here's where the magic would occur. Because somebody who's going this way is going to see the brokenhearted person coming this way. And when they did, they would stop and look into the person's eyes. And they would ask one simple question. In the ancient Hebrew, they would say, Malach, tell me what happened to you. Tell me about your pain. Tell me about your broken heart. And this person, the bereft, the bereaved, the ill, the lonely would say, my heart's broken because my father just died, and I don't even have time to grieve. Or this person would say, my heart is broken because my partner just left, and I had no idea that this was coming. Or they would say, the doctor just called, and it's not a good report. Or they would say, I'm just so worried about my child, and I just need someone to tell me she's going to be okay. Whatever she shared from her broken heart, she would be met with love, because the people who are walking in this direction would hear those words and they would respond with a blessing. Something like, may you be held with love in this place. May you know as you navigate this difficult treatment that you are not alone. May you feel the presence of the Holy One and the presence of friends and family, even as you walk through this darkest chapter. And then they would go on their way. And the reason that this ancient, obscure ritual has been my North Star for 20 years, this ritual that I found by accident so many years ago when I was in seminary, the reason it's been such a guiding light for me is because I came to understand that none of the parties who are engaged in this sacred conversation actually want to be in that conversation at all. So I want to just ask you to think for a moment about a time when you were the brokenhearted. And by the way, every one of us has been the brokenhearted, okay, to different extents. Think about how much courage it takes, not just to get out of bed, but actually to show up in a public environment with a lot of strangers, all of whom are literally walking in one direction, and you are going to walk in the other direction. How vulnerable a person would feel to encounter that many people in that fragile state and to show up anyway. And then when someone asks them, tell me about your heart, to actually answer honestly. And then think about the people who are coming in this direction. And I spent a lot of time as I was researching and writing this book, reading firsthand accounts from the Hajj, from the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca that many Muslims take or strive to take in the course of their lifetime. And what so many of them describe is that literally as soon as they arrive, they burst into tears, they fall to the ground, their legs give out. It's so powerful and so moving to be part of this mass of humanity engaged in this sacred work, in this sacred conversation. And I try to imagine what it would mean to tell somebody who's involved in that sacred circling, there's actually something more important that you need to pay attention to right now than even the power of this spiritual movement that you're in with the masses. And that is to keep your eyes out for a stranger with puffy red eyes who's coming toward you, who seems like they're holding pain in their heart. And yet, that's exactly what they're called to do. And as soon as I recognized and realized that this sacred ritual is precisely a response to individuals and a community that do not want to encounter one another at all, I realized the power of this ritual for our day, which is that the ancients are whispering to us from 2,000 years ago. It is precisely at the moment that you most want to retreat from one another that you must instead turn toward one another. And when we do, we turn toward one another with compassion and with curiosity and with care. That's the message. That's the amen effect. And the challenge of our time is to figure out how we can manifest that sacred move that when we want to turn away, we instead turn toward in our lives, in our churches, in our synagogues, and in our mosques, in the hall of philosophy, in the grocery store, in the book group. How can we take that instinct and turn it around when everything in us is telling us, walk away, avoid, don't make eye contact? By the way, for lots of good reasons, we want to turn away from one another. We want to avoid the funeral and avoid the Shiva minyan or the house of mourning because we don't want to make a mistake or say words to somebody who's in pain that might end up hurting them even more. We don't want to overstep our bounds. We don't want to step close to somebody who's hurting because they might want their privacy. Tell me if any of this resonates with you. We might stay away from people who are hurting, especially people who are hurting the most, because we're scared of catching their hurt, because we're afraid that their pain is contagious, that their divorce is contagious, that their child's illness will actually force us to confront our own vulnerability and our own children's vulnerability. But we all know, because we've all walked in the other direction, that what we need when we're in pain is presence, not absence. And so the call of this book, and I believe the call of our time, is to figure out how to overcome all of those instincts that want to pull us away from one another and instead guide us toward each other. And now I want to invite you to think for a moment, if you would, about the people who enter the sacred space and turn to the right and circle around with their gaze lifted to see who's in pain, who's bereaved and bereft and ill and lonely, either by profession or by character. Some of you do this by profession. Please raise your hand if you are a doctor, nurse, caregiver, hospice worker, rabbi, chaplain, pastor, teacher, police officer. Please share if you are. There are a few of you here, and I bet there are even more. There was years ago a yawn contagion study that was done where the scientists were talking about how empathy is actually a natural biological response, and they put on the screen an image of a person yawning, and then they tracked how many people in the crowd yawned when they saw a yawn, and they realized that those were the most empathic people in the room. But actually, there are people even more empathic who are the ones who yawned, not even from seeing it, but just from hearing the word. So I know it's risky to talk about this in the afternoon after a rainstorm because I might put you to sleep. But there is a kind of natural empathic response that we have as human beings, even though we spend a lot of our time and energy actually trying to avoid responding empathically to one another. But some of us are even more empathic than others. And we're constantly turning to the right and walking with our eyes up, trying to see who needs care. We're the first ones to show up with a lasagna or with brownies that we've baked when there's been a loss in the community. When everyone else runs away from, we run toward. So one of the questions that I have grappled with is, what happens to those people? The ancient rabbis had a formula. They had a mathematical formula to try to understand what happens when a person visits the sick, engages in the mitzvah, the commandment of going to see someone who's unwell. And what they write is that when you visit someone who's not well, you can actually relieve them of 1/60th of the pain that they're holding in their bodies, which means something very interesting. 1/60th it's a very precise formula that comes from the rabbis, but what it indicates to us is you can actually have a measurable difference. You can make a measurable difference in someone else's physical and emotional state when you take care of them, when you show up for them, when you don't run away and you don't retreat. But it's not everything. And even all the love in the world can't save someone who's not well. And even all the visitors in the world can't save someone who's not well. But what I wonder about is what happens to the people who are constantly visiting, who are constantly taking care, who see one patient and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. What happens to their hearts when 1/60th of this person's pain and 1/60th of this person's and 1/60th of this person's all enter into the body? And I'll share with you very personally what happened to me just at the moment that I started to sit down to write this book. So after 18 years of building a community, I went on a sabbatical. And when I arrived in Costa Rica to a beautiful retreat center in the mountains, I sat down and opened up my laptop and tried to figure out, I've written a lot of sermons, how does one write a book? And before me, all I could see were images of my two beloved cousins, Lizzie and Nancy. Lizzie had been diagnosed just 2.5 years before with colon cancer. And at the age of 52, she died from that cancer, leaving 2 children and her beloved husband. The last week of her life, Lizzie showed up at her sister Nancy's wedding. We were all on the rooftop of a beautiful apartment in New York City. Nancy had taken some years to find her beloved Kurt, and they fell deeply in love. And all Lizzie wanted to do was survive to get to that wedding, and she did. She was frail and very, very weak and in a wheelchair, and she made it to the wedding. And after the chuppah, after the wedding ceremony, all of the cousins came over and essentially said goodbye to her. We knew it was the last time we would see her. David and I flew home to Los Angeles and then turned around and came back a week later for her funeral. About half a year after Lizzie died, Nancy was diagnosed with glioblastoma. Totally unrelated cancer, just a freak coincidence. And this was about 14 months after that. And I was sitting down in this most beautiful, idyllic landscape to try to write a book about love and loss and community and healing and how desperately we need one another. And all I could see were my 2 beautiful, beloved cousins dancing before me in memories from our childhood. And then I got the phone call, hadn't even been there an hour, that Nancy had just died. So here I am on top of a mountain in Costa Rica, weeping and trying to figure out if I fly to New York or fly to Los Angeles, how do I get out of here? What do I do? When I felt a sharp shooting pain go down my right side. And I thought it was something strange. Maybe I tweaked my neck, and the pain grew more and more severe as the sun began to set. Now, I'm a rabbi, and it was a Friday. Again, I was alone in Costa Rica, and really alone for the first time in my life, and getting pretty worried. The pain was so severe that I was weeping and wailing and couldn't figure out how to move my right side. And I finally went into the small gathering space where people who were at the retreat center were coming together in order to have dinner. And I desperately asked a person who sat down near me if she knew if there was a doctor on the premises. And she said, "I'm a healer. What do you need?" And I said, "What kind of healer?" And she said, "Maybe I can help you. Come see me in the morning." I was up the entire night screaming and crying, thinking that I was going to have to end up going to a Costa Rican hospital without a phone, without my family, without anyone to help me. And when the morning finally came, I went to see the healer. And she literally put her hand on my right side, and she said, "This is grief pain." Have any of you had grief pain? She said, "This is grief pain." She said, "Do you mind if I touch it for a moment?" And she rubbed my shoulder, and she said, "Who died?" And I said, "My cousin just died yesterday." And she said, "I'm sorry to tell you, this isn't the grief from one person. This is the grief from dozens and dozens and dozens of loved ones." She said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a rabbi." And she said, "I have no idea what that is." So I said, I take care of a community. I'm basically like a pastor, but Jewish. And she said, "Oh, you bury people." She said, "If you ever wondered where the grief lives, it's right here." So with her help, I was able to move through the grief, and I was also able to recognize one of the most important lessons, I think, from life and from our ancient text, which is even for the people who think that we're rightward walkers, there are times when we too walk to the left. And when we do, we need to be held by people who are able to come from the right and hold us. And for many of us, we've had the experience where we walk to the left and we don't have anyone reaching out their arms to hold us too. And one of the most important and painful questions we can ask is, what do you do when nobody's there to catch you, even if you've caught them before? And from that, I have to say, and with this I will close my comments and we'll open up to Q&A and discussion, that in the beginning of the book, I share one of the most painful stories in our community, which is a story of terrible tragedy that struck our community when a beloved family was driving into Joshua Tree for a long weekend with their kids. And their car was struck by a driver driving over 90 miles an hour who was drunk and high and drove with no headlights on and smashed into their car, and both of their children died. And our community showed up with love and held this family as best we possibly could. In fact, the husband, whose name is Colin, wrote a beautiful book about his loss called Finding the Words. The premise of this book, if you haven't read it, and I highly recommend that you do, the premise of this book is that when we are faced with real tragedy, we often say to people, there are no words. But Colin says there are words. We just don't know what the right words are, so let's talk about it and learn what those right words are. But he basically makes the argument, as a non-Jewish person who was married to a Jewish woman and had Jewish kids, that Jewish rituals of showing up actually helped him and his wife survive through this unimaginable loss. Our community showed up night after night after night, and then after Shiva was over, the house of mourning was over day after day until this grieving period was behind them. But 6 months after this loss, we experienced in our community another terrible, tragic loss. And this time, another young person was struck down. And as soon as I got off the phone with the parents that had just lost their own child, I knew that I had to call Gail and Colin and tell them what had happened because they couldn't find out by word of mouth or by email. And so I picked up the phone and I braced myself and I called them. And I could feel that it was like a body blow for them. They were so devastated by what I shared. And then they were silent for a moment, and they paused and they said to me, Sharon, please tell the parents that when they're ready to talk, they should call us. Maybe we can help. And I believe that this is the sacred work of building and being in community. Actually learning how to hold one another precisely when we don't want to, because we know that as human beings, we absolutely need to. We know that in our time, we are living through an epidemic of loneliness, of social alienation and isolation, and we know that it's breaking our spirits. We can feel it. And we see it manifesting not only in our spirits, but in our politics. We can see how it threatens to break our democracy. Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century philosopher, wrote that social alienation and isolation are preconditions for tyranny, that totalitarian regimes cannot take hold in a society in which people know their neighbors. And yet, just before COVID, a study came out that said that 1 in 3 Americans don't know the names of their next-door neighbors. This is part of the reason that this is not just a beautiful place to come in the summer, but this is actually sacred ground, because here people sit on their porches and talk to people as they walk by and know each other. Before COVID came out, there was a study that said that 20% of Americans don't have one single confidant in the world, nobody to turn to when their hearts are broken. This is why the sacred call of our time is to learn how to look toward one another instead of looking away, even or especially when it scares us the most. And the final piece of this puzzle is that the rabbis in that ancient ritual that they described talk not only about the brokenhearted turning to the left and circling around, but also about one more category of human beings who turn to the left when everyone else is turning to the right. Not just the bereft and the bereaved and the ill, but also the ostracized. Those who've been cast out of society by their own doing, by the way. The rabbinic category of nidui, ostracization, was applied only to people who deserved it, presumably. This was a perfect criminal justice system. These were people who had harmed the community in word and in deed, and they had caused so much pain that they were no longer welcome in polite company. We were to distance 6 feet from them, to socially distance from them. We were not to invite them to dinner. They did not come to the interfaith lecture series. They were ostensibly excommunicated, but just one step short of excommunication. Because on the pilgrimage days, they too went up to Jerusalem, and they too climbed those stairs, and they turned like the brokenhearted to the left. And when the community of the faithful encountered them on that sacred circling, instead of walking away from them, or spitting at them, or shunning them, or yelling at them, or reminding them how much pain they had caused, instead, they would look into their eyes, and they would ask them that sacred question, Malach, tell me about your heart. Tell me what happened to you. And that person would answer saying, I am ostracized, in case you didn't know. I've been kicked out of community because I've caused so much pain. And even when faced with that reality, the faithful walking to the right would give them a blessing, because they too are human beings created in God's own image. And they too deserve to be seen in the fullness of their humanity and to be embraced as a blessing. I want to invite us to think about what it would mean in this time of loneliness, social alienation, isolation, extreme political polarization, and growing extremism, for us to actually turn toward each other instead of turning away, for us to see each other's broken hearts and do everything in our power to help each other heal, and for us to actually see even those who are not walking toward us but might even seem like they're coming at us. And instead of demonizing and monsterizing and marginalizing, actually embrace their humanity too. I believe that that is the only way that we will begin to heal as individuals, as a community, and as a society. Thank you so much.